In 2015, the online magazine The Huffington Post released a video entitled "Reverse Racism is a Giant Lie," which amongst other things tried to make the claim that racial minorities cannot be racist. This is because, as the reasoning goes, racism is a function of power, which minorities, by definition, do not possess. This is an idea that has been present in academic circles for quite some time. However, it has only recently been gaining momentum in public discourse, becoming ever more prevalent whenever issues of race or racism are discussed. This is principally why one of the popular talking points that has arisen after the death of George Floyd has been a focus on how white people as a group are either somehow or in some sense collectively responsible for police brutality against minorities, or at least bear a special responsibility for preventing such violence due to their supposedly privileged position within a society that embodies racist bias. In nearly any other context, calling on all members of one particular group to atone for the actions of a minority of individuals would be considered morally unacceptable, and rightly so. It is not hard to reach agreement on the point that to claim all Muslims should be made to feel responsible for the atrocities of ISIS or Al-Qaeda would be a gross act of discrimination. However, as the theory goes, such rules don't apply for white people, either in the UK or the USA, because they are the dominant majority who hold the keys to economic, social and political power. On the face of it, such an idea appears to be fairly cogent. After all, from a historical perspective, all of the most prominent examples of racism that one can easily point to operated on the basis of a very obvious power dynamic of the oppressed and the oppressor, whether it be the European Holocaust, the Atlantic slave trade, the genocides of Rwanda or Darfur, or any number of other instances of racialized violence. It appears that the key ingredient is an unequal distribution of power. To personify the argument, a person stood with their hands chained behind their back can produce a racial slur against their slave master, yet the effect of such an utterance is surely rendered nil by the overwhelming violence that they are likely to receive in return. The prejudice of the slave is as ineffectual as bullets glancing off of an armoured vehicle. Therefore, white people just need to stop feeling sorry for themselves, recognise their privilege, and get with the programme. If, for example, the Labour Party decides to hold an event where they charge white members more money for entry than ethnic minorities, so be it. Power dynamics dictate that racial discrimination can be a force for good, and as such, should be celebrated as a mark of progress. There are, however, a few problems with this concept. Firstly, it would seemingly dictate that some of the most archetypically racist organisations which exist today are indeed nothing of the sort. To take the example of the British National Party, a political organisation that promotes an explicitly racist brand of politics, they are the very definition of a far-right political party. However, the BNP are wholly lacking when it comes to the question of power. Despite contesting elections for 4 decades, the party has no representation whatsoever at any level of British politics, national or local. In the last 10 general elections the party has campaigned in, it has on average won only 0.4% of the vote, often polling less than 0.1% in some years. As for social influence, the party has and continues to receive nothing but relentlessly hostile coverage in the media, and nearly all journalists prepared to give them an interview are seldom doing so for reasons of genuinely exploring the party's political ideology or policy proposals, but out of a fascination for them being a weird and disgusting band of political obscurantists. When the former leader of the BNP, Nick Griffin, was invited to appear on BBC's Question Time in 2009, he had quite a challenge physically making it into the recording studio due to mass protests. Once inside, he sat on a panel of speakers who all roundly attacked his views and gave him little, if any, opportunity to speak unchallenged. Importantly, this is not an invitation to feel sorry for the British National Party. It is merely an observation of the fact that even at the height of their political success in 2010, when they polled 1.9% of the popular vote, their ability to wield power, either politically, socially or economically, was utterly negligible. Therefore, according to theory, without any semblance of power, the BNP can't be described as a racist party. Much the same can be said, in the American context, about the hate-filled narcissist Richard Spencer. Perhaps these figures and organisations should be classed instead as being merely prejudice. in the same way we might describe an African American if he uses the word honky or cracker to disparage a white person. When a neo-Nazi denies the Holocaust, perhaps we should brush it off as not being an act of full-blown racism as such, but merely a distasteful utterance, in the same way as when Malcolm X in 1962 celebrated the crash of an Air France jet and the death of 130 white passengers as being a blessing from God. Such contortions are the result of insisting that racism is exclusively a product of power. Another interesting question also arises with relation to conflict between minority groups. If you read Maajid Nawaz's book and autobiography, Radical, he describes his experience growing up in London in a world in which gangs made up of East Asian youths were in violent conflict with similar gangs of Nigerian descent. He recalls how this violent conflict sadly resulted in the death of rival gang members. But what is one to make of the situation from a standpoint of racism? Neither of the two groups, as impoverished minorities in the British capital, could claim to arguably have a power advantage over the other, either in terms of politics, economics, or social influence. A similar question can be asked of the 2005 Birmingham race riots that broke out between the city's East Asian and Caribbean communities. Perhaps they should be renamed as the Birmingham Prejudice Riots, or the Birmingham Not Racist Race Riots, in order to accommodate the idea that racism can only be a function of power. A third important criticism of the theory arises from the way in which it implies that individuals should be judged on the basis of the aggregate characteristics and dispositions of their ethnic grouping. Individuals disappear as they become mere fragments of a much greater and all-important racial monolith. In technical terms, this can be described as a rejection of methodological individualism. In doing so, such an approach neglects the reality that racism is not in fact experienced by groups, but by individuals. This is why it is more than possible for a member of one racial group to establish a harmful power relation over a member of another racial group, regardless of the aggregate standings of their groups as a whole. In July 2016, an African American gunman in Dallas, Texas, shot dead 5 white police officers and injured 9 others. The gunman, Micah Javier Johnson, stated that it was his intention to kill white people in revenge for violence committed against his own community. As far as power relations are concerned, it is quite clear that Johnson managed to establish a very definite relation of power between him and his victims by aiming a firearm at them. None of his victims were protected by the fact that white Americans earn more on average than African Americans, or by the fact that more white men have occupied the American presidency. Neither was Johnson's ability to pull the trigger obstructed by comparative lack of privilege enjoyed by the ethnic group he belonged to. The case of grooming gangs in the UK provides another cogent reminder of how individuals from one minority can be perfectly capable of establishing coercive power relations over individuals from the supposedly privileged majority. When groups of British Pakistani men raped and sexually assaulted thousands of white girls in the town of Rotherham, the official inquiry uncovered evidence that suggested the fact that the perpetrators were a racial minority actually aided their ability to commit their crimes due to a reluctance by local police forces to investigate for fear of being accused of racism. One does not have to favour the philosophy of Ayn Rand to recognise the importance of her statement about minorities and the individual. Rand reminds us that the smallest and most vulnerable minority on earth is not a racial grouping, but the individual itself. And as such, any single individual can experience racist abuse or discrimination, no matter their skin colour. If all of this wasn't enough, there is indeed one last line of criticism worth mentioning. The Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson has often drawn attention to the lack of any simple method for actually measuring or quantifying precisely how much power one ethnic or social group has over another. Without being able to measure it, the concept of white privilege becomes unfalsifiable. We don't know if things are improving or getting worse, or what policies are needed to eliminate it. Instead, it becomes an open-ended quest, which seemingly can never be satisfied, as well as a useful tool to be exploited by demagogues. In truth, everybody and anyone can be subject to racism, and the truth of this statement is not negated if one racial group is subject to more abuse than another. Reverse racism is not a lie. It exists, and it forms part of the cycle of hatred, a cycle that needs to be broken.